You're listening to episode 77 of the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, Jenni Hulburt is going to show you how to work out without burnout. So stay tuned. Hi, I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm a registered dietitian and coach trained in functional medicine with a passion for helping women just like you ditch perfectionism and use food, fitness, and self-care to fuel your bigger God-given purpose. I believe that it's possible to achieve your biggest life-changing goals without the frustration, obsession, or negative self-talk that so many women subject themselves to every day. All you need are the right tools, the right mindset, and the faith to turn your dreams into reality. I'm here to guide you along the way. The truth is that you are so much more than a body, and I'm on a mission to help you change the way you think and act at a core beliefs level so you can transform your physical, mental, and spiritual health from the inside out. Are you ready to become fed and fearless in your pursuit of a healthy, meaningful life? Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm your host as always, and we have a really great episode for you today, which in my humble opinion, we always have great episodes. But this is one that's really bringing it back to a topic that I used to focus on pretty intensely in my business. Now, many of you know by now that I no longer work with health clients. I've fully transitioned to business coaching for other nutrition professionals, but I still love to talk about these topics that are the ones that I really built my business on. And today we're going to be discussing burnout, specifically how training can actually affect burnout and cause symptoms, what we like to call adrenal fatigue. So it's something that I've been working with women since 2014 on things like quote unquote adrenal fatigue, hormonal issues, all the things that can come from combining under eating with overtraining. And we're really going to talk about the training piece today. So my guest today is Jenni Hulburt. Jenni is a fitness coach, essential oil specialist, host of the Wild Wellness podcast, and creator of the Workout Without Burnout Blueprint. She has a Bachelor of Science and Master's degree in exercise science and sports psychology, and is also a wellness advocate with doTERRA, teaching people about essential oils for non-toxic living, natural health, and creating their own home apothecary with the power of plants. Everything she offers is to help women live and sweat in sync with nature. She believes you can reach your goals without sacrificing your well-being as you seek to embody what nature has always modeled, that it's not a sprint, but a cycle. So I love this topic, and Jenni and I got into some really interesting conversation about women's hormonal cycles and how exercise affects them, as well as how it affects our adrenal function. So lots of topics that I absolutely love chatting about and love to help other women make sure that they are eating and training in a way to feel their best so they can really show up with full energy and purpose in the world. So I'm super pumped to have Jenni on the show. And without further ado, here is Jenni Hulburt. I am super excited to have with me on the show today, Jenni Hulburt. Welcome to the show, Jenni.
Thanks, Laura. I'm grateful to be here.
I would love for you to take this opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners if they don't know you yet, just to tell us your story. How did you get so passionate about helping women overcome burnout and stop overtraining?
Everything that I live and teach about being more connected to nature, which is really what it is, and how we live and move our bodies, came from my experiences that I had in not realizing this, I would say, but more so remembering that. So back in my teens and early 20s, I struggled with an eating disorder for many years, but my recovery and sort of aha moment through getting through that was because I came back to understand nature's food and true nourishment and not getting caught up in packaged foods and processed foods and just really having a more mindful awareness of what I was eating and how that was nourishing my body and looking at it from that angle. But then this other thing that happened in my life that really brought me back to nature and living more connected to that was an experience with burnout, or in my case specifically, it was adrenal issues. And I started to feel really tired. I wasn't feeling myself. I had a lot of aches and pains that were unusual. And in seeking what was going on, I realized that I was having adrenal issues. And as I looked into my lifestyle and what I was doing, it wasn't just how I was taking care of myself because I was eating healthy and I knew a lot about health and wellness and was taking care of my body, but I sort of had this mentality about things and my approach to life, I would say, that was definitely a type A driven sort of hustle, linear, and not really understanding the cyclical nature of things. So I was like always on go, always on overdrive. And that actually translated into the way that I worked out too. So back before that, I had gone to get my bachelor's and master's degrees in exercise science and sports psychology. So by that time, I was working as a personal trainer and really understood the body from a physiological perspective. But what I didn't understand was that cyclical nature that we have, especially as women. And when I really started to embody that and practice it, really guiding myself with that mantra that I've come to teach, which is that it's not a sprint, it's a cycle, I was able to overcome that. And just, it's so much more of a joyful and easy flow with not only workouts, but just how I live my life now. So I love sharing that idea that it's not a sprint, it's a cycle. And I know we're going to get all into that today.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that I've really enjoyed learning a lot more about in the last couple of years, not only with the health and hormone piece, but also with even like entrepreneurship and how women a lot of times are trying to force themselves to fit into kind of more of like a male dominated way of living, whether that is their exercise routine or their work routine, anything like that. And I think it's so interesting to learn more about how women need a different approach, not only with our health, but also with just the way we live our life in general. And I love that you're talking about that from an exercise perspective. So what are some of the most common myths about exercise that people are believing that are out of alignment with what women's bodies needs?
Some that are pretty apparent and some that maybe not so much. So the first one that I would offer is that we seem to have this idea that if we're not working out consistently, that we will lose fitness, we won't get results, or whatever result you're going for, fill in the blank. And it's not that I'm saying we shouldn't move our bodies consistently or that it's not healthy to do so. But I think when women hear the word consistent, they often translate that to mean the same every day or the same every week. And that's not necessarily true because we go through different phases throughout our monthly cycle. And we'll talk about that, but really our monthly cycle of menstruation, or even using nature as a guide with the moon phases or the seasons. We have those outer cycles to follow too if you don't have a menstrual cycle, but those are what can really give us that ebb and flow. So that idea of like use it or lose it, and we have to really stay on the hustle plan to make sure that we don't lose it or that we will not make gains that we want to, that can be misunderstood in some way. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a total myth, but it can just be misunderstood. And another one that I would say is that it's normal to be sore from a workout or worn out afterwards all the time. So again, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be sore sometimes. It means that your body's making adaptations. It means that you may have done something new. But if you're noticing that you're consistently tired and you're always trying to recover, you're not feeling energized, or maybe even start to have trouble sleeping and starting to notice other ways that maybe this fatigue is affecting your life, then that idea of like go hard or don't do it at all, that philosophy can really be damaging, because there's certain times of the cycle, again, where we are really primed to make gains whether that be in strength or endurance or whatever it is. And there's other times that might be more suited for maintenance and recovery. And we really need both. We need both sides of the cycle and both parts of that kind of a plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always thought it was interesting that there's this belief that if you're not sore after your workout, that you didn't do anything, or that being really sore afterwards is indicative of having a really good workout. And it's just funny because I've been training with a strength and conditioning coach for, oh my gosh, I think we're going on like 6 years now. It's kind of nuts. And there's like occasionally times that I'm a little sore after a workout, never anything that's like, I can't move or something. I mean, maybe once in a blue moon, but it's usually because I tweaked something. It's not because the workout was just that level of intensity. But it's just nuts to me because it's like that style of training has worked so well for me to be able to maintain and improve my fitness without feeling sore afterwards, and honestly, hardly sweating sometimes in the workouts. And I remember when I was in my early 20s, mid 20s, I used to think that I had to be sore after a workout, or that, you know, if I couldn't walk down the stairs after a leg day, that like that was a sign that the workout was really effective. And it's just been really eye-opening for me to know that, you know, the soreness piece is not required to have good fitness and to feel good about the progress that I'm making. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I know that right now, at least at the time of this recording, which is in January of 2021, there's a lot of stress in people's lives for a variety of reasons. Obviously, different people have different types of stress, but I think I can say confidently that stress is pretty commonly affecting most people, if not all people in our country right now. And exercise is a very common stress management practice. And a lot of my clients that I've worked with, especially ones that were really trying to repair hormonal issues, had a hard time reducing their workouts because they felt like that was their only stress management tool. So for those people who are using exercise as their key stress management practice, what are some of the downsides that can come from only using exercise to relieve stress?
I'm so glad you asked this. This is so important, because we do use exercise as stress relief, and it can be helpful. I mean, there's good information out there to lend to the idea that it can support our bodies in that. But a lot of times what might happen is I think we use it out of avoidance of actually looking at the root issue, or not even the root issue, but just other things that might be going on for us. And if we only see it as a tool for stress relief and don't consider the fact that it can add stress to our bodies, we'll just say, not necessarily to our life, but to our bodies in particular, then we're possibly going to head down that road to overdoing, overtraining, and just over everything like we do in other areas of our life. Because a lot of times when we are stressed, it's because there's a lot going on. We feel overwhelmed. And I think we are more in that fight or flight mode overall, the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic rest and digest. So again, when you exercise, it can be a really good way to have healthy cortisol rise in your body. I mean, it's normal for you to have cortisol rise when you exercise. It's a hormone that helps us to get up and go and do something and take action and move our bodies and have our blood flow through the body and help blood vessels dilate and things like that. But when you have that sustained and you maybe do too intense of workouts, or you are doing them for too long of a duration or too often, any of those factors could possibly contribute to this. You might have sustained cortisol for too long of a time, and that may just start to be your body's sort of norm in a sense, and you're not getting enough of that downtime where you are in the parasympathetic state or rest and digest when maybe cortisol is lower. And a lot of times we may not even realize this because we're already feeling stressed from other things in life. So we start to maybe feel fatigue and we think, well, that's normal because I'm working out a lot. Or we start to feel just mentally drained or mentally foggy. And so we attribute that to all the stress going on. Or we maybe lose our period and we just think, well, there's a lot of stress in my life. And maybe we don't consider that one of those stressors could be the fact that your workouts aren't really aligning with your cyclical nature, or maybe you are using it as that tool for stress management, but not necessarily balancing it out with other things that can help you relieve stress that might not raise cortisol in the same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I always feel like, having worked with a lot of clients with, the quote unquote adrenal fatigue pattern and hypothalamic amenorrhea, people who oftentimes were combining under eating with overtraining, it was really interesting to see how a lot of times their stress tolerance, just for normal lifestyle stressors like work or relationships or all those things that, obviously you're not going to like quit work or something if it's a little bit stressful, but just those normal day-to-day stressors that we experience, if they were either underfed and or overexercising, I would see that their ability to handle the regular stressors was actually a lot lower. Like they wouldn't have that stress tolerance that they would have had they been eating and exercising appropriately. So it's kind of an interesting vicious cycle that women can get into, where they don't feel like they're handling stress very well. And then they say, oh, I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to go do a really hard like HIIT training session or something like that to help me deal with this stress. But then because they're overtraining or not fueling their workouts, they end up creating this like more exacerbated stress response when things happen outside of the workout. So it's just this like vicious cycle where they're actually creating this situation where it's harder for them to deal with stress. And then the only way that they know how to quote unquote handle the stress is doing something that's actually exacerbating their stress response. Have you seen that with people you've worked with?
Yeah, exactly. And what you described first was exactly my experience too, in that I wasn't feeling as capable of handling stress in general. I didn't feel myself in being able to think cognitively or be focused on things mentally, but I also noticed that things that maybe wouldn't have been difficult for me were bothering me, or that I was feeling really emotional, up and down, just not that grounded stability that I had felt at one time. So I definitely had noticed that. And same as you were saying, that it's a common cycle that I see in women where you're not really considering maybe that the exercise is contributing to the stress, and maybe not seeing the exchange between the two. And it's not as simple as just saying, okay, well, don't work out or work out less. It really doesn't, in my opinion, that's not necessarily the answer, because exercise is healthy for us. It's just doing it in the right way and doing it in the flow of your own personal cycle, which has been so helpful to me and so many other women.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how to sync workouts with them. When you say cycle, I don't know if you're specifically talking to the menstrual cycle or if there's like another type of cycle, but I would love to hear from you. What is this concept of cycle syncing when it comes to the way that people are working out?
Yeah. When I say live and sweat in sync with nature, I say that for a couple reasons, but with nature, meaning our own cyclical nature, our own cyclical rhythm, which might be our menstrual cycle. And also when I say nature, I mean the seasons and even the moon phases, because for women who don't have a menstrual cycle, you can anchor to the moon phases and consider that the new moon would be aligning with day one of a cycle, of a menstrual cycle. And so if you're tracking your own personal cycle and workouts alongside each other, which I highly recommend doing just to start to get an idea of this, day one would be when the new moon occurs. And then you would go on a full cycle until the next new moon, which would start over again. And again, you can use the seasons of nature too. We don't necessarily need to go too deep into that, but just noticing the subtle shifts that we might have in our desire for certain movements and our motivation. I think there's definitely a reason that it wanes or rises in certain seasons, and that we're drawn to certain things versus other times of the year. So that's sort of what I mean by cycles, but we'll focus on the menstrual cycle. And again, kind of translating that over to, if you don't have a menstrual cycle that you're following, this will still apply with the moon phases, and you can follow it that way, because the new moon would be day one, and that is the phase of menstruation. So that phase of the cycle is usually about 5 days long. It's the stage of bleeding. That's when we have our period. And I call this the base phase of the cycle as well, because it's really where you're coming back to baseline, to a more of a maintenance, I would call it, in what you have gained. It's not necessarily a time of the cycle to try to go out and make huge gains, at least in the beginning, because your body is really focused on doing other things, and it's okay to rest. This is a good time to highlight the fact that I see a lot of information out there, a lot of suggestions, maybe that exercising during your period can be helpful. It can help reduce cramps and, so on. We see a lot of those things. And if that's true for you, then go for it and disregard what I'm saying with the opposite of that to be true. But if that's not true for you, then I want you to consider this a permission slip to seriously rest during this phase, because for most women that I've worked with and for myself, this is a phase where you desire more rest. And it's a time when you're not necessarily wanting to do a lot of things that you were doing previously. And it's okay to not mistake that for lack of motivation, because it's quite normal. So slowing down, going inward, retreating, it doesn't mean that you won't do any movement. It's maybe that you're going to do it slower, or that you're going to go for a shorter bout, or that you're going to make more modifications or take more child's poses if it's yoga. Or you may even just want to do more restorative movements that you hold for a long time, instead of going through a lot of faster changes in the movements, and also focusing on areas of your body that might need more attention, like your lower back and hips, because you might have some cramps there, or just those tense muscles from the act of menstruation itself. So in that phase, you can stretch, walk, move, however it feels good to you. Do something that doesn't stress your body even more. And the next phase then would be what I call the build phase. So we go from base to build, because your energy is starting to rise in this phase. And just to go back to the moon phases, this would also line up with the waxing moon. And so because of the rise in our hormones during this phase, particularly estrogen, we do have that rise in energy, but we also are more resilient to cortisol in this phase. So with estrogen rising, your cortisol levels, you're going to be able to manage things better, most likely. So that means that your pain threshold may be higher, your capacity to recover from doing harder efforts will probably be better. So this is a good phase to push yourself a little bit if you feel like doing that, if it's part of your plan. So maybe it's higher intensity cardio intervals, maybe it is doing heavier weights in whatever it is you're doing, but think of more short bursts of activity in whatever it is that you do. And also think of even trying new things in this phase, because you're sort of coming back to life in a way. If you just think of the seasons of nature, this one is most like spring. So after things have taken a rest and been sort of dormant, or appeared to be dormant anyway, this one's like coming back to life and blooming. So it's good to ease into it a little bit and not go too hard too fast, because that would be one caution or challenge that I would say happens in this phase sometimes as women come off of their period. Maybe they've taken a few days off and they're maybe feeling guilty for the rest because they haven't fully embraced or accepted that yet, given themselves that permission to rest, or just because they feel so good and they're ready to go back to it. But either way, either that combination of guilt and energy, you may head into it a little too hard, too fast. So just be careful there. And the next phase then would be ovulation. And I call this the peak phase. So this occurs around halfway through the cycle, and this would correlate with the full moon as well. And it has a real summer energy. So in terms of the seasons of nature, we can metaphorically think of it like this, because your estrogen, your follicle stimulating hormone are peaking during this phase, and peak hormone levels in that way correspond with peak energy. So again, it's kind of like the spring phase in that it's a more yang phase of the cycle, more high energy. And so you can take advantage of that. But in this phase, you may even be more inclined for longer endurance things. So not even just those shorter, intense or short interval type things, but maybe doing a long run or a long hike or a longer, higher intensity or more advanced yoga class, or even doing heavier weights on your strength training, things like that. So It will depend on what you love to do and what your body feels good doing. But think of that phase as the one that you can take advantage of those peak energy levels. And at the same time, I've noticed in charting my own cycle and in hearing from other women that this isn't always the phase where you have all these sustained days of high energy. So this is why it's so important to track your own individual cycle and notice how it is that you're feeling. And I have a template for that where I encourage women to give a rating to each workout and also track other things in their life, like their sleep and just their emotional energy and things like that. Because if you notice that during this phase, you don't have a lot of days where you're feeling high energy, then it might be an indication that maybe you're going too hard in other parts of the cycle, or maybe there's something else going on that you can kind of focus on in your life. Maybe you do notice that you're not getting optimal sleep, or that maybe it's linked to hydration or something that's affecting you physiologically, but then translating to you not feeling your as best as you could in this phase. So don't think of it as like, well, I'm supposed to feel high energy in this phase and I'm not. What's wrong with me? More be curious about it and look at it like you're exploring why that might be and what kind of patterns might be present, because it's quite normal to not necessarily have this be, it's not a textbook kind of match to every woman's body. You may feel different and that's completely fine. And you may even feel different from one cycle to the next. So one month you may have a lot of energy in this phase. Next month you may have less. And so it's just interesting to notice patterns and then see how you can adjust things accordingly. And we have the last phase, which is the premenstrual. So we're coming back down. If you're just even looking at it from a rise and a fall, this is a recovery phase. And so this is the luteal phase. It's associated with the waning moon, and it has the energy of autumn, of the autumn season. So a letting go, a phase where our estrogen levels are actually going to dip after ovulation. They do have a little bit of a rise again, but really progesterone is the one that takes most of the rise during this phase. And when progesterone is higher, we usually feel more sluggish. We don't feel as energized. We don't feel even as mentally focused. And so even though moving your body in some capacity might help during this phase with a lot of the things you might experience premenstrual, like with your mood or bloating or things like that, allow yourself to slow down in this phase too, as you need to. And try not to let that inner critic chime in and beat you up for not doing what you quote unquote should be doing, or not doing it as much, because I know for most women, myself included, this is the phase where you'll probably have the most challenge with that part, because it's like your mind wants to go, but your body's saying, no, let's slow down. It's not time for that right now. So if there's anything to focus on in this phase, other than doing what feels good again, and moderating your intensity, not going too hard or too often, what I would say is focus on something that's maybe alignment oriented or recovery oriented. Like maybe there's a nagging issue you've had throughout the cycle that you can focus on during this time, or just focus on something that gives you a goal, gives you that sense of that you are moving towards something that you have in mind that you want to improve. Maybe, that sense of accomplishment that can come from having focus, but it doesn't have to be intense in order to be that. So just like you were saying before, and we were talking about, if you don't leave the workout feeling sore, then it wasn't enough. This is a phase to focus on something that just because you actually showed up and did it and you were consistent doing it, that is the goal. And that's something to take a look at and to be proud of yourself for, and to boost your confidence. So that's the wrap up of the 4 phases and kind of how our energy shifts and how our workouts could shift throughout.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you for sharing that in so much detail so that everyone understands the way that the different times of the cycle work and all of that. I know we've probably talked about that, the different phases of the menstrual cycle in a different context on this show. So it's great to have it in the context of working out. Now, something that I know that has come to mind for me, and I'm guessing it has come to the mind of other people listening to this podcast, is what happens if you are in a workout, like a class or like either a group or a one-on-one training situation, that you don't necessarily have control over what the planned workout is for that day, then what if anything can you do to keep the attention on where you are in your cycle and still allow you to follow a workout schedule that isn't really changing based on what phase of your menstrual cycle you're in?
Right, because we can often feel that pressure, right, from an outside teacher or guide, or just even a written plan on a piece of paper that this is what we're supposed to do. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for adjusting based on how our body feels. And I know that's one of the biggest challenges or even mistakes that women can make, not in a way that's, difficult, that I'm trying to be difficult on them, but it's a challenge and a mistake because there is another way to do it. And so first I would say, know where you are in your cycle. And I mentioned that earlier, how important it is to track your cycle. And with that, I highly recommend journaling your workouts. And so again, there's a more detailed template for that I can share, but it's basically going to give you really good information to just get started with knowing what day you're on and what you did for the workout that day, and maybe some, details on how you felt, because that's going to show you where you're at. And when you do go to whatever class it is that you're in, or following the plan that is on a piece of paper, then you can ask yourself, what day am I on? What phase am I in? And how am I feeling today? So going into that, knowing that you may be more inclined to push yourself and be capable of recovering from it a little easier. So if you are feeling a little sluggish going into it, it might be a good time to test it out. Maybe you're just feeling sluggish from something that happened that day. Maybe you've been sitting at the computer all day, or maybe something stressful happened that sort of made you feel a little less like moving. But in reality, when you get into the class and you start moving and you get through the warm up, you actually do feel better. So all of that, taking all of that into consideration, can be really helpful to then guide you in making a personal decision on what that class looks like for you. And if you know that you're in a phase of the cycle when maybe you're in more of a recovery phase, more of a maintenance, you don't really want to push yourself too much because you're wanting to optimize your health and your hormones and feel the best you can, then going into a class knowing that can allow you to take those modifications that are offered, or just sit certain parts out if you need to and do something else, or take more rest, take more break. And I know that can be a difficult thing to do when it's a social situation, because you look around and everyone else is doing something else, but it's a good practice in and of itself for life in general, I think, in being able to do what's best for you and not necessarily follow what everyone else is doing just because everyone else is doing it. So checking in with yourself beforehand and then being able to adjust based on what you need. And as you start to do that, I think you may even notice what it is that you need to do in order to adjust, whether it's take a break or maybe only do part of it, maybe do less reps, or, adjusting certain aspects of the workout.
Yeah. And I know that obviously different environments are going to be more or less conducive to that, having worked with my trainer for a while and then also having done other group exercise programs, that kind of thing. It's very interesting to see how, like, when I'm with my trainer, he knows me well enough that, like, if I tell him I don't want to do something or I want to change something, there is never any sort of like pushback or anything like that. But I have been in situations before where it was like, if you started to do something different than what the rest of the group was doing, the trainer would be like, kind of, I don't know, not in a mean way, but kind of in a, oh, like, come on, you can do it. Like,
right.
Keep working.
Encourage
or something.
You. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to be pretty good at not letting that affect me, but sometimes it's hard if somebody's telling you should be doing something and you're not, and then it's like awkward, everybody else is doing it. It's actually one of the big reasons I don't really do group exercise anymore. I mean, I have a Peloton bike, which I guess is like kind of group exercise, but it's like you're in your living room by yourself. So if you want to stop for a second, nobody knows that you're doing that. So do you have any advice for women who are in a training situation where they like the workouts they're doing, they want to keep doing it, but when they try to be more mindful of their own needs, that there's like either from the trainer or from other people, which honestly, I might say that from other people in the group workout can be almost worse. What advice do you have for them for handling that or responding to that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, what you brought up. And first thing that came to mind for me was communicating that with the teacher even beforehand, like just letting them know, I'm going to do what I need to do today. It's not because I don't want to follow your lead on things, but, I just need to practice or move in a way that's best for my body. And I think most people would really honor that, even if they misinterpreted it beforehand as, oh, this person needs more encouragement and I need to push them a little bit more. But if you actually told them like, no, I'm good. Like, beforehand, maybe next class, I'm not slowing down or stopping because I'm not respecting you guiding me or what you have in mind. It's just that I need to do something different today. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing I would say is thinking back to those 4 phases of the cycle. The ones that we'll go back to the base phase and the build phase. So the ones that are the follicular ovulation phase, those are ones that we feel more outward, more capable, more magnetic, more energized anyway. Whereas the luteal phase, that premenstrual, and then the menstrual phase, the base phase, those are going to be ones where you're feeling more inward and you actually may not be as resilient to criticisms or being able to go against the norm on things. Like you may be more sensitive, we'll say. So those would be times that I would just say opt out of doing a group workout, and do something else that is more solo so that you're not influenced by that as much. And you can really tune in to what your body needs and listen to that and not be distracted by either a trainer or an instructor or other people in the class who are doing other things or wanting you to do other things. And you can just be more focused on what that is, because during those phases, you'll be less likely to handle that anyway. So just don't set yourself up for that in the first place and choose to do things more solo and leave the other phases for those times when you get out there and do things with the group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, I guess maybe this past year with a lot of group classes being limited, it might not be as much of an issue, but I know for a lot of people that do those group classes, it can feel really awkward if they don't, like, even if you don't show up sometimes. I swear, when I used to do CrossFit, and I'm not, side note, I'm not like bashing CrossFit, but I remember when I was doing CrossFit, there used to be a couple people that if you were out for a few days, they'd be like, where have you been? Like, what's going on? That kind of thing. And I really, I believe that it's out of them being, kind and wanting to encourage you and that kind of thing. But it is just this kind of weird environment sometimes where you do have to get comfortable kind of, I don't want to say speaking up for yourself, but speaking with clarity on your decisions and not being like nervous or embarrassed by it. I tell my trainer all the time if I'm like on my period or if I'm like, oh, I'm like about to have my period, so I feel like, maybe my energy's not great. Like, and he's a pretty like, bro kind of dude guy. So like, he's not like, oh yeah, I want to talk about your menstrual cycle. But I've just gotten very open about that kind of stuff. Cause at the end of the day, I'm like, if I know that my energy is not as good as normal, I want to make sure that I'm sharing that. And I'm not like just letting him kind of say, oh, like work harder. And not that he says it like that, but if he's like, you can push it harder, like get a couple more reps out. I don't want to just be like following what he's telling me to do without having any sort of input on it.
Yeah, that's important to communicate for sure. And what you're saying reminds me of the side of maybe fitness culture that really doesn't honor all phases of the cycle. And it's more about that linear masculine model that's about productivity and taking action. And it really doesn't see that other side of rest and recovery or more intuitive movement as valuable or as good. Like we were saying earlier, it's like, it's good if you feel sore. It's not good if you don't feel sore. It's like that two sides of the culture that oftentimes the one is more emphasized and more overpowering. It's louder And so it's just even helpful to notice that in general, the fact that you brought that up and that we're talking about it, because that right there was really eye-opening to me as a personal trainer, and understanding that that was a message that I didn't want to continue to perpetuate. I wanted to leave space for honoring the whole cycle and individual needs of a person, more so than I even had before, because of course you can say that, yeah, it's all about the individual and personalized plan, but you can still do that without really thinking about a woman's cyclical body and how that might be different at different times.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I know that you had mentioned a little bit ago that this can also apply to seasons. If you could just kind of like in a quick couple minutes, just explain with the seasons of like, I'm assuming spring, summer, fall, that kind of thing. Are there some like little tweaks that people might consider making as the seasons are changing?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to notice for each of us, because, of course, the seasons are going to feel different depending on where you live in the world as well. But if you think of just the two ends of the spectrum with seasons, spring and summer being more yang energy. So that's a concept of heat and masculine energy and more outward energy, versus the other side, which is more yin and cool and restful, slower. That would be autumn and winter. So if you just even consider what your inclination might be during those times, it's interesting to notice what you might want at sometimes versus what you might want at other times. And one thing I'll say is that it's, we start to feel different maybe from doing one thing. Maybe we have been training in a certain way. Maybe we've been doing a certain workout or going to a certain class, and all of a sudden the seasons shift and we start to feel different. We start to not feel like doing that as much. We start to feel like doing something else. And if we're open to that, then it's easy and we can shift and flow with the seasons just like they change. But if we're resistant to that, I think that's when we start to hear that inner critic come in, and it kind of, is like, well, you're not motivated. You need to still be doing that. And so I would just encourage those listening to not be so rigid and just really consider that if we do flow with the seasons, just like nature models for us, that it might be better for us overall anyway. And so think of balancing when you think of the seasons. In the summer or in even spring, when there's more heat and it's hotter and the days are longer, well, you don't want too much heat. So you kind of want to balance that with coolness. And so working out at cooler times of day would be helpful. But at the same time, the days are longer. So in terms of your movement, you may do more movement overall. Like you may actually do longer workouts, longer runs, longer hikes. You may do more of them than you do in other times of the year. And in winter, when you do shorter, more intense perhaps bursts of activity, that's going to generate heat, which counterbalances the coolness of that time of year. So it sort of can make sense that way if you're focusing on moderate, longer duration things that aren't raising your body temperature too much during the summer, but it's also paralleling those long days, versus the winter where it's shorter, intense bursts to help with the heat, and you're also paralleling the shorter days during that time. So that could be just a basic guide to maybe start with if you want to start to notice some patterns that you might have. And again, I would say as you're tracking and journaling with your own cycle and your own workouts, just notice how the things within yourself shift depending on the season and what you might be able to change instead of just trying to do the same thing all the time.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And it's very, very different than I think the way that a lot of us learned how to work out. Well, even speaking for myself, like just when we started exercising on our own, which I feel like for me was really like college, I would say, because I was always an athlete. And, when you're an athlete, you don't really like choose your workouts. You just do what the team's doing. And it's not really like you have to go to the gym or go for a run or whatever. So I feel like when I first started training when I was in my 20s, I feel like it was always this very formulaic, like, this is what I do. And, here's how hard I work. And here's how long I'm at the gym. And here's how many days I go. And it was never really something that I used any sort of like cyclical information about it or, having any sort of like intuitive approach to it. It was just very like regimented. And I do think when you're in your 20s, you can probably handle it a little bit better maybe than you can do when you're in your 30s or when you start to get older and your body's not quite as resilient. But I definitely feel like for me personally, over the last 5 or 6 years, just being more in tune with my body and just not having that mindset that like I have to like work really hard and push myself really hard to get value from exercise, I think has been really helpful. And that's not to say that I don't ever push myself. Like I definitely do. And I like to kind of get up to that edge of like, what am I capable of on a semi-regular basis? But it's definitely not the goal of every workout to feel like I pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion every time I go to the gym, or at this point it's my house because now I just work out at home. But I feel like having that mindset has been really helpful, and it takes a lot of the stress, not only mentally but physically, out of my workouts and allows me to actually get the benefit without creating damage or causing excessive fatigue or soreness or anything that is really not the reason that I would be working out ever. Like I'm not, feeling sore is not valuable if you like remove the potential of, muscle development or strength development from that soreness. So feeling sore all the time is, at best not helpful, and at worst actually could be harmful as far as it getting in the way of you living a normal life. So for me, I'm just like, okay, if I'm sore once in a while, that's fine. But I no longer have that goal to get sore as being the indicator that the workout was effective. So hopefully people listening to this episode have the opportunity now to think differently about the way that they schedule their workouts and to think differently about the mindset that they bring into the workouts and how that can be influenced or guided by, like you said, the different phases of the menstrual cycle or the moon phases, or even just paying attention to their own body. So there's so much information here. I feel like we could definitely keep talking, and I'm sure you would have a lot more to share. Is there any like last final points you want to make about this topic for people to take home, or just to help guide their thinking about implementing this process into their workout strategy?
I would just add the one simple idea that you were really just talking about, which is that we can reach our goals without sacrificing our health along the way. And everything that we've learned about how that might not line up, that, we can consider a different way. And it is more cyclical, and it is more in line with nature. And we have that to really look to embody. So yes, you can reach your goals without sacrificing your health.
It seems like that should be so obvious, but it's really, I feel like it's something that, especially if you're a type A person, it's hard to really embody that. Even if I don't know, sometimes I just think about even the way that I approach entrepreneurship. There's a lot of times I have to kind of like slow down and say, no, I don't have to work that hard. Like it's not worth it if I'm sacrificing my mental or physical well-being at the, in the pursuit of growing a specific type of business. So being able to think about any goals we have and making sure we're always checking in and making sure it's actually benefiting us and not causing harm. It sounds so obvious, but it is something that I think a lot of us tend to get stuck on if we're the kind of person that has a lot of goals we want to reach. So
we all need the reminder.
Yes, definitely. So Jenni, this was really awesome to hear all this knowledge that you have and just being able to talk about this in a really practical way. And I know you have a lot more places that people can learn more if they want to get in touch with you or to learn more about your methodology. So where should our audience go to connect with you further?
Thanks, Laura. They can go to jennihulburt.com to continue this exploration. And I'm at Jenni Hulburt on social media, on Instagram. I also have a podcast called The Wild Wellness Podcast. So you can listen there as well.
Awesome. And we'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes for the episode today. And my final question for you, which is one that I tend to ask most of my guests if I remember to, is what do you believe makes a person more than a body?
Oh, our connection to nature is the first thing that comes to my mind. We realize that we're a part of something that is not only within us, but also that we can see is happening outside of us. And as you've learned from me, I just think that that is such a guide for our well-being in so many ways, from what we eat to how we move to how we approach the cycles and the rhythms of our own life. And that would be what I would share, or what I would say about that.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time and your expertise today, Jenni. It was really great to get to chat with you. And I know that the audience should have learned a lot, and I'll be excited to hear what they take away from this episode and the kind of changes they make to their workout routine now that they know this important information. So thanks to all of you for hanging out with us for the last 45 minutes or so, and we will see you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Hey there, Laura here again. Thank you so much for listening to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Your time is your most precious resource, and I'm so grateful that you choose to spend some of it with me. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast and want to continue supporting my work on this show, I would very much appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes. By leaving a 5-star review, you'll help others find the show and help me spread my message to a larger audience. You can go to fedandfearless.com/review to find a button that'll take you right to iTunes to leave your review. And I have a special gift for you as a thank you for helping me share the podcast. Once you leave your review, send a screenshot of the review to hello@lauraschoenfeldrd.com. Or you can DM it to me on Instagram @lauraschoenfeldrd. Once you do, I'll share a free copy of my Overcoming Undereating ebook. Then share a favorite podcast episode in your Instagram stories and tag me @lauraschoenfeldrd. And I'll also give you a free copy of my 14-day calorie challenge recipe guide. Together, these bonuses are worth $44 and will help you become Fed and Fearless. And you'll get them absolutely free for just helping me grow the podcast. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you here next week for the latest episode.